Welcome to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron, and I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling. The goal here is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. Today, I'm going to talk about short fiction, but more specifically, I'm going to talk about how short fiction can actually help improve your longer form writing. Also, I'm going to talk about some lessons learned and some key takeaways that I've had while writing and publishing around a dozen short stories. We'll be covering 3 key points, and I'll also go over a little bit of my own path to publication. Short stories have been around forever, and a perspective that I've really started to adopt is that a novel is really just a series of short stories strung together. Now, this is a bit hyperbolic, but using this with the right frame of mind can be incredibly useful when it comes to writing longer projects. Being able to break those bigger projects down into smaller bite-sized pieces has not only helped me in my overall workflow, but has also made me more effective with my storytelling. It's something that I've really implemented on my long-form writing, making these early drafts a lot more manageable and cleaner when they come out. To sort of back up and give a bit of perspective of where I'm coming from, I'll be brief about talking about my own background and how short stories have sort of impacted my own writing and my own publishing journey. As of filming this episode, I've published around a dozen short stories. Of course, by no means is writing and drafting and submitting and trying to get a short story published easier necessarily than doing so with something long form. It's just different in a couple of ways. There's definitely a faster process or timeline, but the actual art and science behind writing and submitting and drafting something that is a short story doesn't necessarily make it easier. And when we're talking about the benefits of writing short fiction and what we can get out of it and how we can kind of implement it and the skills that we can learn to then use in our longer fiction, they go a bit like this. The first thing that I realized when it came to writing short fiction and practicing the science of telling a story in a short form was the act of practicing finishing stories. And that's really a hard thing to practice when it comes to long form, judging by just the amount of time you'll spend and the amount of time you'll invest into a project. But going through the entire process of starting a story at its inception, whether that's an idea or a concept, and then slowly building off of that concept into things like an outline or even the actual story itself, can be a very long process, and a process in which you really need to invest a lot of time and effort and energy into it. Writing short stories was really the first time that I started to work that muscle of seeing a project from its beginning to its end. And seeing that process play out is incredibly beneficial. I can remember when I was working on a long form project and I had dabbled a little bit here and there with short stories and whatnot, but I would hit these points where I was editing or revising and I hadn't really written like a new word or a new chapter or a new scene in such a long time that I almost forgot, or where I thought I had actually forgotten how to write. And that can be a bit of a scary thing, but it also is a sign that there are these different stages of writing require different muscles and different skills. Revising is just as important of a skill to master as actually writing. And also too, the process of approaching the same project at different stages is something that we often lose track of when we're working on something long form, especially if it's a debut. Or even the process that goes into finding a home or finding a place to sell your story. Doing that is sometimes more difficult and more time consuming than the actual writing itself. And having never been able to practice that, if you are stuck in revisions or if you are working on a project for a long period of time, once you hit that point where you're ready to find an agent or find a publisher or find a home for whatever story it is, you've never gone through that process of shopping your story around, of writing query letters, and of writing even your bio, it can sometimes be it can sometimes stop you in your tracks in the overall process of finishing a product. The next biggest thing that I sort of learned when writing short fiction was the impact and sort of the power behind starting small. We often get very excited when it comes to writing a project or jumping right into a scene, and that can sometimes be useful, but starting small kind of helps you get the big picture of your story. We want to understand what the essence of our story is. In order to, I would say, before you actually begin writing, you need to know what the essence is of that story or of that scene or two scenes that's going to be in that short story. Because everything is so succinct and tightly written and you're constrained to only so many words, you have to really have an understanding of what direction and what your story is actually about. I think when it comes to long form, we have a little more flexibility and leeway to meander and find our way through the plot and through other characters and test out different parts of our story before we really know what our story is about. Or we may have an idea what our story is about, but we want to explore all these other tangential things, tying them back to this central idea. But writing short fiction really forces you to understand the core of that story. And more so about the starting small isn't necessarily the essence, but the scene. And this is an element that became beneficial to me when I knew I had word count restraints and a limited cast and a limited amount of time to tell a story. And that's kind of to make a scene impactful. Knowing how to write a scene is essentially, when I said earlier that a novel is basically just a string of short stories tied together, what it really is it's a string of scenes. And most times when it comes to short fiction, we are really just writing one or two or maybe three scenes, depending on how long our short story is. But knowing how to write a scene and write a scene that resonates, whether it be thematically or a scene that has some sort of meaning, or we close the circle of our plot. The scene itself, when we are writing from the perspective of a short story, has to be tight and has to mean something. It has to have some sort of payoff, which was a bit of a revelation for me and actually kind of changed how I approached my outlining and also the way that I tend to now write my longer projects. When I'm doing my first draft, outline all of the chapters and sort of the overall arc of the story. And when I have an idea of how many chapters I might want, I try to write one scene as a microfiction scene. So that's under 1,000 words. Sometimes I try to keep it under 100 if I'm kind of stuck on a scene or I know something needs to happen in the plot or between these characters. I will try to do it in under 100 words. But the idea is that I am trying to get through that zero draft as fast as I can. And by doing that, I focus on important scenes that are happening throughout the story. And then from there, once you have an idea of those scenes, or at least the most important scenes in your story, you can then start to write around those and include either make those scenes bigger or include buildups and trail-offs. You can write more around each of those important points. And kind of in that same regard, another element that really helped me, or something I took from short fiction and am now using it in not just my long fiction, honestly, but all of my fiction, is that when we write short stories, or if we're writing our manuscript and we're using kind of this strategy of using short stories to sort of tell the longer story, is that we have a lot of flexibility and there's a lot of low stakes involved. We often have a story idea, try to write it, And we may get 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, or maybe even we write the entire book and we realize that there really isn't a story there, or that our concept that we have, we're stretching it to its thinnest of thin membranes, and it sort of is either broken or didn't really feel as fleshed out and as meaty as we kind of thought it was going to be. And this can happen for longer projects as well, as if we, are outlining and we want to play with certain twists or certain scenes. We can write those as a short story or microfiction within our larger project, just to kind of see how it fits in with the rest of the story or the story that we want to tell. But having low stakes and having the flexibility to change ideas or pivot is really a feature to short stories. And something too that I like to do, especially if a scene is giving me difficulties or I'm stuck in my story, is that I'll often start to write from other characters' points of view and just see how that changes a scene or changes overall the story in general. It's that practice of writing a scene or having the flexibility to write something without any intention of publishing it or putting it out there. But it will give you, the writer, a more broad perspective of your story or of a scene. There's a bunch of other things we can do as well, even just as writing exercises, such as writing different tropes that you might not have written before, but might want to implement in the future, or even writing in different genres and different types of point of view. But the biggest thing is that this is practice, or it can be practice. Every project before the project that you're working on now, in a way, is practice. Short fiction can be a great tool, not just to help with publishing credentials or have your work get out there and then start to sell your work, but it also can be a really powerful tool in learning how to tell better stories. But that's a good place to sort of stop and leave it. I hope you found this useful. Short stories and short fiction is something that I'm always exploring and playing around with. But you should let me know if you do the same. Have you ever written a short story, or do you enjoy writing short stories? Let me know what you're wrestling with, as I'm always curious to hear what you all are working on, what you've learned, and even some of the things you might want me to cover next. That's all to say. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.